Hi everyone, welcome back. And today we are continuing our discussion on A Wrinkle in Time. If you haven't seen the first video where I talked about some of Madeleine L'Engle's philosophies and the controversies over this book, please make sure you go back and watch it. And if you haven't seen the summary of the book, make sure that you go back and watch that too. To pick up where I left off, I mentioned last time that I did not care for the adaptation of this book. I have to tell you, I was really looking forward to it. I thought that it was a great choice to make the book more diverse, or make the characters more diverse, to have a blended family with an African American mother and a Caucasian father. I thought that was an interesting choice, and I thought that they could do a lot with that because one of the primary themes of this book has to do with being an outcast. And I think that even today, a lot of people who are in a blended family or who come from a multiracial or multi-ethnic background feel like they are outcasts in the society, or that they don't fit in with one group or another, and not all the time, but certainly the way that internet trolls treat people, and with some of the political rhetoric that's going on today, I think that some people can feel that way. The problem with the casting was not with the kids, who I think did a great job. The problem was with the adults. The people who played Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Which, and Mrs. Who. And the reason for that is that the way that they are depicted in the book. Also, there's another, I should say before I get into this, there's another adaptation, but it was a made-for-TV movie, and it was just not, it didn't have a good budget, and for that reason, it kind of didn't do very well. It was very slow and didn't have good effects. This movie had great effects, but it wasn't done right. It lost the magic. But anyway, so these three, Mrs. Which, Mrs. Who, Mrs. Whatsit, they're dressed in layers of odd clothes. They look almost homeless. Mrs. Which can only speak in quotes, and they are described as being abnormal or witchy. And almost most importantly to me, they're old. They're old. And why is this important? Well, first of all, it does add to the controversy of the book that people who were more conservative did not like the fact that their children were reading about witches who were kind of like positive role models and witches at the same time. But when you look at who society ignores and who it does not treat well, particularly in the 1960s, but even till today, if you, I'm thinking right now of this great scene in this show, Grace and Frankie, where we have two older women. They're trying to get the attention of people in a supermarket, and they just start screaming, "Look at me, damn it! You will look at me and you will pay attention to me." Just because someone's older does not mean that they lose value. Women in particular are only valued in our society when they are sexual. So children, very often not. Older women, very often not. And you have a window, and the beauty industry is really dependent on making teens look older and making people in their 30s and 40s look younger to fit that window and to fit that standard. So the fact that they are old and witchy and decrepit looking, and they look homeless, and yet Charles Wallace has the empathy and the understanding enough to interact with them and to bring them into his home. And that is important because it's trying to show that one outcast is connecting with another outcast, and that they can still have value, and that they can still do things to save the universe and to make the world a better place. And so there's this real heartfelt message that even if you don't fit in, that doesn't mean that you're not valuable. That doesn't mean that you can contribute to, this idea that she has of fighting off the darkness and being a source of light. You don't have to look a certain way or behave a certain way in order to be this. And quite frankly, if you don't fit in, you might have a better chance of changing the world for the better. And in the movie, they're played by Mindy Kaling, Reese Witherspoon, and Oprah Winfrey. So 3 people who are wealthy and attractive, and yes, it's diverse casting, but also in another way it's not diverse casting, because they're gorgeous, and even Oprah, who's a little bit older, still looks very youthful. Mindy Kaling is quite young at the time, comparatively. Reese Witherspoon looks like she's 20, even though she's in her 40s. So I think that misses the mark, and they're very sparkly almost from the beginning, in my opinion. So the idea of not fitting in, I'd like you to take a look at that, and I might even give you guys a clip from the movie to kind of so you can kind of compare it to the book if you haven't seen the film, because it was not good. The pacing was also wrong, and the magic wasn't there, and they changed things that shouldn't have been changed. But anyway, so we have Meg, we have Calvin, and we have Charles Wallace, and we have Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray would, I think, to contemporary readers, look like she is a conformist, or at least look like someone who fits in, even though people talk about her behind her back because her husband's gone. But 1962, she's a theoretical physicist and a mom at the same time. And women in STEM fields even today are pretty still a minority. So back then it would have been a very small minority. So I think one of the reasons that people are talking about her is not just because her husband's gone, but also because of this unusual career path that she's taken. So that's something to watch for too, how people talk about her and what they say. Calvin does seem to conform as well. He plays basketball, he seems to be popular, and yet he really does not, and he feels kind of different because of some of his abilities. And then we have Meg, who doesn't fit in because of her anger and the situation with her father. She feels like she doesn't fit in 2 ways. The first is that she hates her looks. And I almost wish that this wasn't in this book. We'll talk about feminism in a minute, but a teenage girl hating her body is not that unusual, right? But she also has this anger over her father being gone. She has an anger over how she and her siblings are treated, and so she doesn't fit in at school and really anywhere else. She sometimes doesn't feel even like she fits in at home. Then we have Charles Wallace. And the way that he is described is that he's almost a new kind of being. So he and Calvin have this discussion. And Calvin says, "Are you a sport?" And being a sport is kind of hard to explain because we don't live in the 50s or 60s. It kind of means, if you say being a good sport, somebody who's kind or generous, or they kind of go with the flow, right? But it seems that they're using this term between the two of them to mean something a little bit deeper, so look for that conversation. Charles Wallace is by the 3 people who are shepherding them through this journey, and they're very clear about the fact that he is something new or different, and that Calvin is kind of also in this category. And Charles Wallace and Calvin says, "What about Meg?" And Charles Wallace says, "She's not one thing or the other." So there is a hint here about evolution, and there was a theory at the time that wasn't fully explained or described until I think around 1970s, so a little bit after this book, but I think that this is the theory that she's playing around with. The theory is that there are children who later on are called Indigo Children. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes here so I can kind of explain this to you correctly. And the idea with Indigo Children is that they were almost, this is kind of a pseudoscientific New Age concept, but that they're special or unusual, that they have some kind of supernatural traits or abilities, but that these supernatural traits and abilities like ESP can be explained by evolution, and that we have children who are coming up who they seem to be different. And some of the characteristics, here we go. Empathetic, curious, strong-willed, perceived by friends or family as being strange, possessing a clear sense of self-definition and purpose, showing a strong, innate, subconscious spirituality, not necessarily in religious areas, but just spirituality, personal growth, or connection to God, connection to the universe. Strong feeling of entitlement, high intelligence, high intuition, and a resistance to rigid control-based paradigms of authority. So again, this idea of nonconformity. I think that what you also see starting around this time are children who are on the autism spectrum. And we didn't have a great understanding of autism, really, even up until the last few decades. We didn't have a good understanding of it. But I think that could have a little bit to do with it. There are students or children at the time who had some learning disabilities, but learning disability does not connect at all to intelligence. You can be highly intelligent and have a learning disability. You also have people being diagnosed with ADD and ADHD who are thought to kind of be in this category. So Charles Wallace is highly intelligent. He is a genius, and he is supposed to be kind of beyond a genius. So I'd like you to watch for that. And how do each of these characters, what flaws do they have that are further separating them from people and from love? And what positive qualities do they have that are separating them from people? So the idea here is that, nonconformity is a positive quality and a positive trait. Not surprising, is it? Probably that we are at the very beginning of the 1960s. We're coming out of this time in the 1950s where the idea is that after World War II, we need to work together for peace and prosperity. So we have a lot of reverting after the war, when women were working for the war effort. We have a reverting back to traditional gender roles. We have the idea that people should be good Americans, that you should maybe conform to be a good American, which is interesting because most of World War II, at least in Europe, part of the problem there was that people did conform, right? So we see that as an issue. And also in the USSR, which the United States was placed against in the 50s and 60s and into the 80s, a lot of the communist ideal is based on conformity. So it's kind of interesting that America and the USSR, they just have kind of competing ideas of conformity. But really, this book is at the precipice of the sweeping social change that will take over the country really a year later after President Kennedy is shot, that you have these changes in understanding of gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity as the civil rights movement becomes plays a larger role, although it has been going on for a little bit of time by this point. The idea of people who have been labeled the other and who have been outcast now trying to take power. People who are Black and they're living under Jim Crow laws and they're not allowed to vote. People who are women and they're not allowed to have equal pay. People who we talked about before have disabilities, right? Which Charles Wallace talks about Meg talks about Charles Wallace not being able to talk and then all of a sudden talking in full sentences. And so with with these changes, I think this book is kind of looking forward to those changes in the way that speculative fiction does, and saying we need to get out of this society where we're conforming. The twins in the story are probably the most conformist, and they get their own book later. They're written out of, I think, both movies they were written out of, but at least the most recent film version of this, they're written out. But they appear, they have pleasant appearance, they are popular, they are well liked, and then yet they are in this strange family that they find themselves kind of sticking up for their sister and brother very often. So look for kind of how they play a role in this idea of being an outcast and being a conformist. Certainly, the idea of conformity comes to a head on the planet Camazotz. It's a dystopian planet where everyone is fully conforming, and the pulse that everybody's heart beats to is strong, and resisting that is really the climax of the novel. So the idea of there being outcasts, the idea then that outcasts are kind of set up to fight conformity because they're already kind of not part of the machinery of society. They're outside of it, so they can fight it a little bit more easily. And then we have feminism in this book as well. Women in STEM fields, which I already talked about with Mrs. Murray. The idea of Meg being the heroine of this book. She is a questing hero, and her love interest, Calvin, is kind of secondary. Many books prior to this did not have a female protagonist, and they often, especially in fantasy and science fiction even today, very often have a male protagonist whose love interest is a female and is secondary. If you guys think back to The Princess of Mars, this is a perfect example of that, right? Ender's Game, which we're going to be reading next time, it doesn't really, there are a few female characters, but not many, and they don't play as large of a role as the males do, for the most part. So, yeah, the idea that her story is kind of central and that Calvin's is kind of secondary, that she is there to protect Charles Wallace. Calvin is there to protect her in a way, kind of, but really it's more emotional. It's really more emotional to give her support in an emotional way rather than a physical protection that we would see. She's not a damsel in distress. That's the way I would put it. So the other idea here, as a female protagonist, I think there's a lot of other sci-fi, especially YA sci-fi, that features girls that kind of draw from some of possibly this book as inspiration. Anne McCaffrey's work in fantasy, The Hunger Games with Katniss, Hermione, and Harry Potter, Divergent, The Uglies, Matched, all of these have female protagonists, and I don't know if this book was an inspiration for that, but I think certainly it was one of the books that one of the first books that had a female protagonist in this way. So the other thing, though, in terms of feminism is not just that Meg is the center of this story, but also that she is angry and pissed off. And that could be seen as not really a feminine trait. And yet her anger and rage is sometimes positive, and it's sometimes righteous anger. And there are things that are unjust that she should be angry about. And I would like you to look for the places where her mother talks about finding a happy medium and almost saying to her, you really shouldn't be so angry. I don't know if the book were written today, if we would have quite that scene, or if her mother would say, yeah, your principal's being kind of a jerk and we need to go and do something about that. Or, your brother is being bullied. Why are you the only one standing up for him? Why are the teachers not doing anything? And this really is the book The Feminine Mystique, which is one of the books that kicked off the second wave of feminism, was written a year after this book, actually by someone that the author knew. And this is before the Equal Pay Act, making it illegal to pay men and women differently for the same job. This is before the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which did not pass, but that came up in the 70s and was much under debate. So before a lot of social change in the realm of women's rights. And the idea here that anger can be a weapon for change, particularly by someone who's an outcast, particularly against a society that's conformist, is a really important message in the book. So look for places where she has anger that's not justified, or at least she's told it's not justified. Look for places where she has anger that is boiling over and kind of too extreme, and then look for places where her anger is held up and confirmed as something that she can use for the better, to change society. I will say too, her mom is a scientist, but also quite feminine, and those were two things that really people would have seen as being opposed at the time as well. So that's another little thing to look for. And the way that the love interest is portrayed, and the way that Calvin kind of functions in this space of being a male and being an athletic male, and the ways that he supports Meg in this very feminist kind of way. So I'm going to have a different type of presentation for you guys on the some of the science in this book. Some of the concepts are, if you want to dig into them as an adult and not just kind of see them for words on a page the way a lot of kids do when they read this book. I want to talk a little bit about the Tesseract, dark matter, and Einstein's theories of relativity, gravitational waves of space-time, and all of that kind of thing. So that is what we will be talking about later. And I hope that this was helpful, and I can't wait to see your thoughts about the book. And I especially, for people who have read it before, I hope that you get something new out of it. Thanks.